backgrounds. Obviously, you're all very fit for purpose to be on this stage. We've talked about it a little bit in the intros, but I'm very curious about how, in your present day, you are using AI. It obviously comes in many different forms, but talk a little bit about how it's integrated into your workflow, what you are actually, where you're seeing it deliver the most value so far, where do you hesitate to rely on it, especially, let's say, if there are specific complex studies that you are like, no, we're going to use traditional workflow for that, or you're seeing it's really changing the game for. So curious, we can start with you, Mike.
Yeah. Well, so think about us as a lab company. We're generating a lot of data, so we're a primary data generator, and a lot of what was presented earlier this morning is applicable to us. We use our data for that sort of foundational layer of structuring data. We don't get nice, clean claims data that was demoed earlier. We get a lot of medical records and unstructured data and testing results from all kinds of different testing modalities. And so we use AI a lot of times to derive structured data from that. We'll probably get into it a little bit later, like the importance of that data being source verifiable and maintaining that linkage. But one of the biggest areas of lift there is because we are a lab company and not a true data company, is AI is a force multiplier for our limited resources for doing abstraction of medical records or reading our pathologists. We have a large pathology team that's reading slides. We're using AI to help them with how they're reading slides, how we're reporting out on our test reports. On the more progressive end, though, it's we're using it for our feasibilities and trying to explore the data once it is structured. And I think that's a really cool use case for running quick feasibilities, benchmarking them against publicly available data sets. For me, with my domain area knowledge, Paul's discussion about getting that flow state, that's what I seek to get into all the time, is trying to answer questions and iterate on that and follow my nose in the data itself. And we're seeing that help us on the strategic side of is our data, I asked a question to say, how suitable is this data set for evidence generation? And getting having this dialogue going back and forth when we have limited resources. I don't have a robust biostatistics team that I can go to that's going to actually perform that. So it allows me to hack it and kind of punch above my weight a little bit personally, and allows my team to do things like coding and data engineering tasks and that kind of thing as well. But we don't have a lot of analytical resources, and so we rely heavily on that and partners that do specialize in that space. So I'm really interested in hearing more about their use cases for it and in terms of generating analyses.
You can switch it up. Let's make it interesting. Chris.
Yes. So we use it, I think, in two ways. One, just general work, just a general work companion, so notes taken in meetings, synthesizing kind of emails, things of that nature. So we use it in just traditional working scenarios, and I think we're getting better at that as well too. But then also in the workflow of our research that we're developing as well too. So the goal, I guess, is to aim towards full adoption end-to-end process, right? From protocol development through analysis of the data through synthesizing reports and also manuscript writing as well. So that's kind of the goal, to get that in place. I think we're on that journey to do that. I think the analytics team that I have is, they're here, thanks. They're working a lot on generating the analytics and using AI actively, as they start to go through and do a lot of the analysis. We have kind of pilots in process for manuscript writing as well. And our synthesis team uses a lot of analytics AI-based tools to help pull evidence forward and synthesize that evidence as we try to make it, useful for the rest of our stakeholders in the organization, which is mostly around pulling that evidence through for commercial use or medical use or our account directors and so forth as well. So pretty extensively using AI across our whole process right now.
And I think on our side, where we sort of most value, at least from an analytical standpoint, so we have it as like a companion that accompanies you for documents creation, generations, tables, summarization. It does very well with that. But on the analytics side, one of the things that I saw happen more is that inherently when you're designing a study, you bring to the table some sort of expectations about what the data would look like based on your just prior experience in the industry, in that indication, and a similar indication. So you have some sort of analogous comparison that of the things and how they would like, and then you design around that, sets your hypothesis, and then pick your models and designs and decisions around these expectations. And I think one thing that has been kind of accelerating is like introducing AI in the context of these brainstorming sessions, allowing us to get a general viewpoints of what is it that we're actually seeing in that specific use cases, and very early on being able to fine tune and think through the problems in different ways, where I felt like it's been kind of harder as a companion is like the accuracy and kind of, if you're shooting for a high level quality, auditable, publication grade or regulatory grade work streams, I think this is where it gets harder sometimes to almost disentangle what is generated by the AI than doing it from scratch. Use the example with George of like fixing a clay pot. Sometimes it's just easier to break it and then rebuild it than try and fixing it. So, but it does a good job at painting you like, oh, that's what the clay pot will look like in this context at that time with that data. It's been a massive accelerator of like generating ideas and validating them on the spot. So you pursue less ideas that do not pan out to be good ones. Yeah.
How about you, George?
So thanks to Chris. I mean, I just remember that, yeah, we do use a lot of Copilot for the regular taking of meeting notes and transcribing. So that is something that's been phenomenal. And that suddenly triggered that we do also use AI for something that many of you will be familiar with. So if you're working on, if you're in core health economics and you work on AMCP dossiers, and then you realize there's JCA dossiers, there's country level dossiers. So one of the pilots that our global team sort of helped us with is mapping the dossiers, because I don't want someone like Patrick to charge me twice to write the same chapter. So, you know, especially when I can audit it and say, no, the requirements for the chapters are the same, why are you charging me twice? So that's something that we've sort of piloted, where it's worked out rather well, saying that, you know what, chapter 7 from JCA is the same as chapter 4 from NICE, which is the same as chapter 2 from AMCP in terms of the content, but this is what's different. So I think that was a really cool application that we're still working on. You do need a human being in the loop who is sort of a subject matter expert on what is it that they're asking for. Sometimes AI does not understand ITCs, NMAs, and the specifics. But once you have a human in the loop, I think you can get about 80 to 90% way there. Besides that, like I said, because of the 4 domains of health economics, I think we are cautiously optimistic, and we will be piloting AI applications in real-world evidence. And we've also got a work stream that's, like I said, which is happening in systematic literature review and evidence synthesis, but that's outside the scope right now, and also one for modeling. So I think what has happened is, if most of you should be familiar with Komodo's KRD Plus database. So we've been fortunate enough that over the past 3 years, we've had about 6 publications, abstract posters, and about 3 manuscripts. So we have enough of a bolus of evidence that we are just curious to see, okay, what happens when we give it just bare minimum information? Is it able to 90% predict or get us to the answer that we want? And what is it it's getting right versus what is it it's not getting right? What is it getting wrong? And what happens if you incrementally give it a little more data? Like we give it just the abstract, we give it just the poster, or do I need to give it the whole study report with the appendices for it to be able to replicate the results? So that'll give us the scale of information it needs to reach where we're already at right now.
I think that's I'm kind of hearing this use case. It's like the same way I've been thinking about it, maybe building up, like demonstrating the capabilities and our comfort level with using AI at a certain layer. And it's like the early days where it was the Wild West, it was awesome because it was like, you're kind of doing this iterative hypothesis generation. Oh, can you get me even something that's directionally correct? Yeah. And then you start building off, and as you get more confidence around that, you start asking more and more things. And I think we're really on the cusp of this place where we're actually using it not necessarily just to develop the hypothesis, but how do we use AI to ensure that the data is fit for purpose? Yeah. Like, can we use it to answer that actual question rather than like do incremental things up to that point. And I think once we're there and we're comfortable with using it for that, it won't be that hard to use it to actually generate the analysis results.
Right.
And I neglected to mention that as well. We're using it extensively for demonstrating the capabilities of our data set by doing like longitudinal like patient journey studies, just to show that, hey, these are the characteristics of the data that we have, and kind of increasing the awareness that, oh, well, maybe neogenomics or, and really any lab that's trying to think about it in a sophisticated way should be thinking about it this way too, is like maybe the data that they're being generated actually has a higher tier use case than just telling you where a patient shows up with a particular biomarker, right? So that's a use case that you guys reminded me of. It's really exciting.
I think there was a lot of like thematic consistency that leads into the next part of like what validation looks like for all of you, right? So it seems like the way that I would approach validation, or how we do at Komodo, is like you want to compare it to your gold standard that you've previously generated using your traditional workflow, right? Does that resonate with you? Would you, I mean, I'm talking about it from the perspective of a real-world evidence study, right? So different than that, did it capture the notes correctly from a co-pilot? But if we think of it in more like the analytics aspect, like curious to how you all do validation, if it's similar to what I just suggested, or if there's anything novel that you've been trying to do. Yeah, Patrick.
The validation part, I think, is the biggest impact when we think about how Gen AI and products like Marmot will influence like the work, at least from our perspective, from an analytical firm standpoint. We're already seeing that the execution isn't the biggest amount of time that we spend now with the coding assist and like the blind coding and vibe coding and cloud code and coworks, and like this automation makes the execution more trivial than it used to be. On the counterpart, so if you only look at that, the efficiency gains are massive. And going back to your question, I think what we've seen though is the part about the audit, the critically thinking about the assumptions and reviewing the work in the context and making sure that like you're not getting stuck in, I think it's easier to get on board with a nice story that is being told to you than when you're thinking about it, you haven't seen the story, you haven't seen the data. And I think what LLMs right now are doing very well is to make sense of what they see in the data and tell you compelling stories with supports and evidence. And so taking the step back and thinking about, okay, but what is it I'm asking him? What is it that he's seeing? What could be driving this other than that very compelling story that's being told by the model to you? And so that aspect of the critical thinking, bringing in, George mentions that, I'm sure you'll have more to say about it, but bringing in the experts, thinking about like the underlying, the data, what is it you're looking into? Paul alluded earlier and had like significant conversation about it, and Anna as well, of like these trend breaks in the data. And so you can come into a place where there was a certain sources in California that switched up on the Komodo back end. And so it looks like there is a 30% market loss for a given drug in California that year. Whereas, again, the underlying sources is what's driving that change. And then the LLM will try and figure out, oh, there was also this publications in this somewhat obscure outlet that says something about the drug wasn't working when Adversivan was in a journal, and so that's probably what's driving that difference, right? And so if you don't think about it and just go with it, it's easy to get stuck in that or take it at face value. So experts, multiple people looking at it, critically like not accepting the hypothesis and the results and really challenging it from the get-go, I think makes a huge difference. And so in our systems, we have multiple layers of people critically thinking and challenging different assumptions that builds into the models itself. And then external validation in our context with KOLs has been a major component to it.
So, may I?
Yeah, go. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you touched on, Hannah, was workflow. So both of us here have similar trainings. Both of us here have, we are leading health economics groups, but his disease areas are different from mine. Mine are completely different from his. Yeah. So the workflow implementation is something that, I've always been curious about because everybody implements things differently. Mm-hmm. So for me, and just sort of leveraging what you said, basically fit for purpose, but I'd also like to add the concept of context of use. So what are we using AI to answer? Is it something that needs to be put, like Amit said, right in front of the board, in front of the regulators, or is this just for rapid analytics? So fit for purpose and context of use is something that we are really struggling with in terms of our workflow. I don't want to throw Paul under the bus, but that example that he gave on the screen is a really good example. And then we're like, but that's not really how we think about it. If that was the question that was asked, and if suppose we need to sort of give an answer back to the board, is there anything that we would have done differently in that 2 minutes that Paul had in front of 500 people to be able to answer the same question? So while Paul was explaining, and of course I had the luxury of sitting on the last row, and I can Google, I'm like, Paul, but there's already a publication on prevalence of DME. You don't need to reinvent the codes. And then I'm like, okay, who published that paper? It was from UPenn School of Medicine, Department of Ophthalmology. I think I can't challenge those people when it comes to the use of codes. So I would say, Paul, just use those codes and just make sure. Then you leverage Marmot, saying, Marmot, these are the codes. Tell me the incidence and prevalence that I'm looking for. But of course, remember, Paul was in front of all of us, and he was trying to do this in real time. So there's a difference in application. So what would happen then for us would be, well, if I needed to give that answer in 5 minutes and give it to the board, I'd say, this is what I found in 5 minutes. This is a UPenn paper. These are the codes I have. This is what Marmot is telling me. Marmot is running on KRD Plus, which we're using for our traditional applications. Mm-hmm. If you gave me 1 month, I'll give you a slightly different answer. If you give me 6 months, I'll give you the world's best answer. Mm-hmm. But in that time frame, again, it all depends on the context of use. Will that be an answer that you want to put into the introductory section of your phase 3 clinical trial protocol for DME? Absolutely not, right? So again, context of use matters. Do you really want to put this in front of your regulators? So that's something that we've been struggling with in terms of workflow and context of use.
Yeah, I think the concept of human in the loop, I think it's interesting because I think there's multiple layers. And one thing that I'm also thinking about is trust, right? We trust Hopkins School of Medicine's ophthalmology department.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
I think we're at the very infantile stage of AI use where we don't trust right now. And so we have human in the loop at a very basic level. So assisted coding, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't trust that they're going to do the AI agent's going to do the coding, and we back off and we let it go, and then So I think we're still in that very infancy stage across the board, and then we expect people to have that expertise, validate through face validity, validate through other methods, potentially also use other AI agents to validate with other AI agents, and so there's still a lot of that human in the loop at a very basic level, at the very lowest levels. And so I don't know how much efficiency gain we're getting. We're getting efficiency gains, but it's still at the lowest part because we're still just implementing and trying to work out the process. So, hopefully we'll get to a point where we have more human in the loop always, but at a little bit higher levels, so that we can recognize faster processing. And some of the outcomes that we kind of hope to achieve, right? But I think it's going to take a while to get there because it's the trust issue. And every time there's a hallucination in the AI models or something that comes up, we kind of trust less, and that goes back down, and then we apply more human in the loop at a lower level again.
Yeah.
I want to I'll eventually get to the human in the loop because I think that's interesting to touch on. But first, with the trust aspect, I think one of the first times I spoke to Patrick, he said, when we were talking about Marmot, he said, I don't care if the results are wrong or they deviate from my expectation as long as I can see transparently what the methodology was that got us there. Yeah. So my question for you, and Chris, you could start about the trust aspect, is like, what is your comfort level of, what's your margin of error that you're comfortable with, and what's the explainability behind it for you? Are you immediately going to jump to the underlying data? Are you going to assume it's a hallucination, and how do you try to guardrail it from your own use of it?
Yeah. So I thought about this a little bit in different ways. So I'm a little bit worried and scared that right now most of it's around face validity and checking. It's kind of like if you've ever taught and you had students, they bring you something, it's completely wrong because that's not the way the world works, right? And you know it very quickly because of your expertise and experience. And I think we still see this from a lot of our AI agents and models that we have, is that it's out grabbing data, it's out making calculations, predictions, and all of a sudden it grabs something that's so wildly wrong that we know. I think as they become more sophisticated, it's going to be harder to know when it's wrong, because it's not going to be a difference of 27 and 89. It's going to be a difference of 27 and 29. And I think that's where it gets a little scary. However, I'm also, highly statistical. So I think we use Markov models and simulations a lot too, and we run simulations and we look at distributions, and then we can help understand confidence intervals around parameter estimates and so forth too. So I think that there is a situation in which we can use multiple AI agents for validation. We can use simulation to help us get around some level of confidence in intervals and so forth. So I do think that we can employ a little bit more of that, and maybe that's how we start to characterize things as, the forecast said 27%, but we do have a margin of error because we ran a simulation 1,000 times, and this is where we think we are, right?
Yeah.
So
I think I like to think of an analogy just coming from, again, pulling the lab side, but we do sensitivity and specificity all the time for like diagnostic tests.
Yeah.
And we accept a certain amount of variance in those for, and we put them on the market. So I think we're just, at this point, we're sort of evaluating the same kind of measures on our like AI methodology for extracting this. So what are we comfortable with? How can we reduce the error in those data sets? And it's great that we have these really like much larger data sets. We have, we can validate we can do orthogonal validation with other external data sets or prior publications and all that to benchmark those. Mm-hmm. And as AI gets even better at ingesting external data sets and external or publicly available data and published data, that they can, hopefully we can keep training them to get better utilizing that data to making those predictions to a point where we'll be comfortable with it. And that human in the loop piece is going to keep shrinking.
Yeah.
But I still, like we were talking about when you want the whole idea of getting human sort of out of the loop. I see that, but I'm like still, I think everyone else is just like, it's not getting there. And I'm right there too. I think maybe there's a future where we're comfortable with it, but not yet.
And I think there's places where we're probably comfortable with it, right? Like in the sense of like, again, what is it using for? I think on our side, what we've noted a lot is that one, right? Like there's a huge inflection point in the last year. So if like you used coding assist tools or coding tools just a year ago versus now, there's a massive difference in how they perform and how well they deliver. But even at a 95% precision or efficiencies right from the models, if you think about like a classical HOR projects, you probably have a pipeline that includes upwards of 10 to 15 codes, right, that goes into it. So your formats, your cleanings, your sample selections, your patient characteristics, and then all of them build onto each other and are reused in the next versions and then complexified to your outcomes, OS, PFS, then algorithm building. Well, that 5% that is kind of missing is like interest, right? It's compounding over the span of the entire project. So if you're lucky through your knowledge of the 27, 29, they kind of end up canceling each other. So but you could also be in a place where they always get you further apart from like the reality. Mm-hmm. And we had a real example of this, of like, if you go back then into these individual cases and you try to find that 5%, that doesn't exactly does it. It's really a needle in a haystack problem to some extent. And a great example of that is we're doing like at-scale extraction of unstructured nodes right now, right? And so it does, LLM do amazing, but one of the way that you bring it back into structured is the standard JSON formats that you then convert into a CSV. LLMs create what we call like pseudo JSON. But once in a while it gets a bit crazy and decides I'm going to put a semicolon here where it should be a column. And so if you have 1,000 lines, it's pretty easy to go through it when you're trying to figure out what is the line where it should be a semicolon and it's not. But if you're doing it on 1 million nodes and you've extracted 10 entities or 10 concepts from the nodes, and then you're stuck with over 100 million lines. And so going into it and trying to find these semicolons, that doesn't work. And JSON conversion works. If it's not JSON totally, it doesn't convert anything. It doesn't just convert those that are properly defined, right? And so that just creates these types of problems where, to the example, you got there, if it's a 10-hour task, you got there 80, 90%, 95% of the way in 5 minutes. But by the time you figure out how to get to the 100%, you still have spent like maybe 6, 7, 8 hours. So it still reduces significantly the global efficiencies that we're seeing from AI because of that kind of, how do we get to that last frontier of being very precise?
Yeah. And for me, at least, the error compounding that Patrick talked about, I mean, we worked on this. So if you work on ultra rare diseases or tumor types where the sample sizes are triple digits to begin with in Komodo, that rate of error compounding will just manifest itself in sample size issues. So unfortunately, AI does not know what it does not know. So one of the things that we found out was that there were, in one of the studies we did with KRD, the traditional way, we're finding patients who are going from first line therapy straight to palliative care, which is the very last line of therapy in oncology. And our medical expert is like, I don't believe you, this is impossible. And we were going to lose about 20, 30 patients. And he's like, that cannot happen unless you document renal insufficiency in this format. So unless your AI has gone to medical school for that particular disease, it would not know that, right? And that will always be hidden in this particular case. And we could not afford to lose that sample because we were doing a treatment pattern analysis. So then I think in this particular case, the analytic team went back and they were able to find the documentation of renal insufficiency right in that middle of that. And he's like, okay, but not for all the patients, but at least 13 to 17 patients were preserved in that tiny sample size because our clinical expert is like, no, this should not happen unless you document it. Mm-hmm. And that itself was a finding, right?
Yeah. I think one thing is going to be interesting in like these Komodo ohms and how they generate together is how can we bring that knowledge, once you've built the foundations for indications within your organization, how do you bring that in so that the model can now refer to it and become something that they do know, right? So human in the loop supports of the process. How do you then bring it up so that like then the model can leverage that knowledge that has been built as foundations for future work? I think it's going to be super interesting to see how that helps kind of, again, nudge the model towards that trust that you were talking about.
Yeah.
I think Diego talked about it this morning where in a part of R&D that I hadn't even thought of about like you need to maintain some type of human in the loop when you're doing drug discovery because you cannot patent anything. Right? Like that didn't even cross my mind obviously because we're in such a myopic space that is farther down the funnel. But I mean you've all touched on it now, but in terms of where you see humans always needing to be within this loop narrative, where is it, right? I mean, it's like very different too. We saw that obviously somehow doctors make AI worse, right? But AI will never replace, an anesthesiologist having to intubate a human, right? So like there are places where it's always going to be foundational to have their involvement. So curious, Chris, from your perspective.
It's funny, I was just thinking about an analogy. I think like cars, right? Fully autonomous cars. If you think about that process, I mean, we have fully autonomous cars that are out there, but we still have, assisted driving, AI-based driving as well. I know I turn mine off when I'm driving in New Jersey because it's just you don't want to get killed. But then there's different comfort levels, right, with that, and there's different people that may not drive at all, and then you think that every time an autonomous car has an accident, that's kind of like a hallucination, and everybody loses trust. And even though the regular drivers are making lots of mistakes and a lot of wrecks, so you still, I think it's somewhere along that, and there's a comfort zone at some point. And I think we can all imagine a world in which every car is autonomous, right? Potentially. So I think I think maybe the data points for that are a lot less than what we deal with, right? If you think about driving and what are the data points that it's looking at, it's looking at the road, it's looking at other things. I think what we deal with is probably a lot more data and a lot more data points that is coming at us in drug development, discovery, everything that we're doing. So I think it's going to take longer, but I think we're going to get there at some point, but it's not necessarily. So I've learned that there's two different groups. There's people that believe there's always got to be a human in the loop, and then there's people out there that believe there should be full autonomy as well. And I think it's going to be a process, and I think it's that layering, right? Like it's just eventually going to start getting less human in the loop with some activities, and things.
The
You know.
former is probably a little
Yeah.
self-preservation.
Yeah, well, and that's true because there are a lot of people that still drive cars that have no autonomous features, no assisted driving, and so forth, and it's going to take a long time to get along that pathway.
But even with, to use an analogy like Waymo, there are
Yeah.
still individuals who are behind computers to override
Okay,
wrong
yeah.
turns and crashes, and so there are humans. They're just a little
Yeah.
bit more hidden.
And there's people that refuse to get in the back seat of one
Yeah.
as well too,
Sure.
right? So yeah.
So, I guess there's also probably there's like a limitless amount of creativity
Right.
that goes into all of these questions, right?
Yes.
Because even as we're starting to create like micro niche environments of just like lung cancer, right? Now
Yeah.
there's like different rare populations of lung cancer, and so
Yeah.
there's always these like a multitude of like deviations that you can come in from like a scientist perspective
Yeah.
that may be very hard to be automated from an AI perspective.
So for me,
yeah.
at least, I believe that at least next 5 years, at least, you have to have a human in the loop. I mean, it just depends on the context of use. It depends on the question that we're asking. We had asked Patrick saying, "Can you give us the weight for a particular kind of cancer?" And he's like, "Okay, I can give you that." And he gave us an answer. Let's assume it's 70 kgs. But at that point in time, using the tools he has, he gave us an answer of 70 kgs. A month later, we spoke to a medical expert. He's like, "Yeah, but if you're on androgen depletion therapy, that's going to cause you to, gain weight significantly." We did not know that. He did not know that. So then again, the point here is that who's ultimately responsible for that answer? Patrick will say, "Well, you told me to run it. I ran it using the codes that I had. It's 70 kgs, but now the real answer is closer to 99 kgs, which is in the wrong direction." But we wouldn't know that until we had that additional layer of information. And yeah, so.
There's a collaborative. I think right now we historically we exist in this world where you needed to collaborate across all your different experts who could bring various pieces to actually answer a question or generate the hypothesis, test it, and then come up with a reasonable solution to it. And I think that what we're seeing is AI is starting to take bits and pieces of it, and those more creative aspects you were talking about, like the more creative roles, like this is what I hang my job on right now, is that I know the questions to ask it that's going to give us a compelling answer that's going to tell us, where should we be investing? Where should we, is it worth, spending more on analytics here, or can we automate that? Is it worth investing in our data engineering here, or can AI do that transformation for us? There's a lot of those type of things that are happening. But to make maybe a little bit more of like a bold future claim here is I think that ultimately we're going to get to a place where the only human in the loop may be the patient. Mm-hmm. And where the patient ends up being the one that gets empowered to actually ask the question about what to the AI who functionally orders the tests and gets all the results back, runs the studies, and comes back to them with an answer of like, oh, this is the right thing that you should have to. Now this could be 10, 15, 20 years from now, who knows? But I think that's ultimately the only human that we can reliably say will always be in the loop.
Yeah.
I think this is recorded, and I'm gonna take the stance of I've seen so many predictions on AI, and I think about this funding papers that went out. I think of the early GPTs that were talking about the problems for the decades to come. So by the time it got published, all of these problems of the decades that AI was going to try to solve have been solved. So I'll reserve the right to not make a prediction on camera about where I think the human in the loop problem goes.
You're on record.
From here, yeah.
Well, I think too, when we're now democratizing the ability to get an answer to anyone. Even if you ask the wrong question, you're still going to get an answer that seems very confident.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I'm going off script, so sorry if you prepared your answers from the questions that we had. But in terms of bias mitigation, right? How do you see that taking off? Because you could ask a completely wrong question and get a great answer to a very poorly worded.
I think you could ask your friend that's a neurosurgeon how to fix your plumbing, and
Yeah.
it may not be accurate, right? So I think maybe you treat it like it's a very smart friend of yours, but they may not know everything.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think maybe that's the
a great
approach.
way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I make parallels about like access to information. When we got access to information, a lot of great things happened. We shared a lot of science and knowledge, and also a lot of bad information started being sharing. I think we're going to see that with the event of the access to AI and data, is that we already see it, right? If you work within like a pharma company, there's medical affairs, research, commercial, HEOR, clinical, and you oftentimes can have 5 different answers to the same questions. And the worst about it is that sometimes 3 of those are true answers, but just asked from a different perspective and at different angles and a different context. So they yield different numbers. And so I think we're going to see that. I think this flooding the gate of information from AI and data is definitely going to happen. And I think it's going to be hard to discernate between the truth within that access.
I really like his neurosurgeon about plumbing example. So this is not in real world. Like I said, we're piloting it in the 2 disciplines, which is systematic literature reviews and evidence synthesis. So without divulging too much, there are tools that allow you to sort of plug in AI into an Excel, and Excel produces health economic models. And the answers look scary and credible until you ask the next level question. So it says, you said, okay, can you develop a model for this particular disease state? And it says, yes, I read the leading paper, which, I built a model which is based on this particular trial. I'm just making it like Galaxy trial. So we're like, okay, how did you get access to Galaxy that's published in New England Journal of Medicine? I didn't say I used Galaxy, I said Galaxy-like trial. So like, whoa. Yeah, so that was like, when you delve a little deeper, right? It's like your neurosurgeon friend saying, if I read the New Jersey plumbing handbook, it would say this. Sounds really credible. And like, where did you get access to it? Oh no, I didn't say I did.
Yeah.
So that's
Or
really
I saw it
scary.
on TikTok.
Exactly.
We've definitely come a long way since, I don't know, a year and a half ago. I think I was trying to have it help me write a white paper, and have it ask me to give it some citations for it. And it literally created a brand new citation.
Yeah.
And it took 2 actual authors who had published in that space, made them co-authors. They'd never published together, and then presented they gave me an abstract. They gave me all this stuff, and I was like, oh, this has got it. Like, this is great. This is exactly what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that hints us to the things. Like, the more confident it sounds, the more rosy the results, the more you have to suspect that it's wrong, and you got to scrutinize it all the more for that. So we're quite a ways. Now, I will say, like, I haven't had to do that to me in the last several months. I think it's gotten better. But that just probably means it's being more sneaky in the ways that it's generated.
But it's also a weird way to interact with it, because I think a lot of users interact with it in the way that you would an analyst or a researcher or someone within your firm that does it. And it's kind of a weird way to interact. If every time you talk to analysts or researcher within your firms and you doubt that anything they tell you is true all the time, it would just create for a very weird, so like we're not wired that way, right? So when you ask a question, you get an answer. You don't, like, oh, did you make this whole thing up? Right? It's the reflex, you're like, oh, okay, great, you have it, you have the source to your point, you have the citation, the authors, you're like, great. You don't have to ask your analyst, is that true, or you just write it up? Right? Is that number a real thing, or you just wanted me to be right because I said my hypothesis is this, and then you generated something to validate me, right? So I think it's going to have a lot of rewiring in how we approach information as well, that we didn't have to do when humans were at the wheel.
In this example where, the modeling team was so proud of the fact that it gave it one prompt and it was able to produce this entire model. But when I sort of took a look at it from one level about that, the modeling team was like, look, it's populated, everything, your DFS, OS, PFS is already populated, it's in Excel, it's ready to go. And they were so proud of that fact. And we're like, yeah, but you just realized that it hallucinated, that it did not access that particular trial. So every digit in there could be wrong unless you go back to New England Journal and actually read it to make sure that the data exists. And therefore now I'm calling into question your modeling abilities if you're believing this at face value. So I think, but it's a good discussion to have. That's why these pilots are very, very important.
I mean, I think that just tied it all together about where validation still needs, or how validation still needs to exist, how that human in the loop is going to be, and should be performing that validation still. But then again, how this can actually impact the workflow. So I guess last question before we open it up to the audience, because I see the timing that we have. If you could give one piece of advice to real-world evidence leaders who are evaluating or implementing AI today, doesn't have to be a marmot, but maybe something more in the analytics space versus something to help with note-taking, what would it be? Start with you.
Well, I guess my initial thought would be sort of what I just said, is like, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. That's maybe the cautionary piece of advice, but I would say that, in echoing what was said earlier in the stage too, is embracing that change management. Like, people are worried about what it's going to do with jobs and that kind of thing, but I think that it's going to unlock so much potential for what we can do with biomedical data and going from research grade data to evidence grade, regulatory grade data. I think there's so much potential there that the risk of not really giving it a full trial and piloting it is much greater than the risk of it hallucinating and telling you a wrong answer, as long as you proceed with caution. So.
For me also, just to echo Mike, I would say there's definitely a lot of potential. You must pilot it yourself, validate it against something you know. You will get your own answers, because your answers are your own answers. They're very different from our answers. So you will know exactly where it's going wrong against something if you validate it.
Yeah, I think similar lines. I mean, I think be very optimistic, be innovative, try new things, try different things, but then be very critical of what's being produced. And I think if you lead teams and lead people, you want to institute that same kind of approach and culture in your organization, that they're responsible, not the AI, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're responsible for the content coming out. If your modeler ends up producing something that's inaccurate, wrong, it's their job. They're the ones going to get fired, not the AI tool. So I think making sure that your team and your people are critical, but then also jump in and embrace new innovation and be optimistic about where we can go.
Get started. I think whatever it is where it is right now, there's so much value that it brings to the table in different ways, and it's evolving so fast that I think get started is going to be the general one. I think in the process of using it, rethink your structure and your work process. There's a lot of the way that we work right now, pre-AI, that is because only humans are in the loop. And so sometimes if you try to squeeze in AI within your existing process, it makes it worse or not much efficient. But if you take a step back and think, now that we have that ability, how do we organize the work around it, rather than trying to fit it within your day-to-day work streams?
So be curious, but trust and verify in the new flavor.
Yeah.
of the game.